In every age, value is more than numbers. It is a mirror of the human soul. Before there were theories of wealth, before graphs and equations claimed to measure human progress, there was a boy standing by the Scottish shore, watching ships disappear beyond the horizon. Each vessel carried something the villagers could only imagine. Stories, goods, destinies. For young Adam Smith, that horizon became a question. Why do people trade? Why does one man's work feed another's dream? And why, beneath all of it, does the desire for freedom burn so quietly, yet so fiercely? Kirkcaldy, 1723. A small town of stone and salt where the North Sea winds carved both faces and character. Smith's father had died months before his birth, a customs officer who believed in duty, rules, and the moral weight of order. His mother, Margaret Douglas, would raise him alone. She was patient, protective, almost ascetic in devotion. From her, Smith inherited not only tenderness, but a sense that virtue had to precede ambition, that a man's worth could not be counted in coins, but in conscience. He was frail, prone to daydreams and long walks. Neighbors called him the absent-minded boy, but absence, in his case, was a kind of presence, a retreat into thought. When he looked at the fishermen or the merchants in the harbor, he didn't just see commerce, he saw connection. Exchange to him was a moral act long before it became an economic one. Every sale, every bargain was an invisible handshake, a tiny covenant of trust. By 14, Smith entered the University of Glasgow, a place alive with the Enlightenment's electricity. Francis Hutcheson, his professor, spoke not of wealth but of virtue, of how man, guided by an inner moral sense, sought happiness through benevolence. Hutcheson's lectures were revolutionary, not because they rejected reason, but because they humanized it. Smith listened in silence, absorbing not formulas but philosophies. He began to see morality not as divine decree, but as a social instinct, a spontaneous order rising from empathy itself. Glasgow was a living classroom. Merchants debated prices in taverns. Sailors argued over navigation and fortune. The city pulsed with ambition, a new world emerging from trade and trust. Here, Smith witnessed something profound. When individuals pursued their interests within the bounds of virtue, the result wasn't chaos, it was harmony. This idea would germinate quietly for decades before finding its full expression in the wealth of nations. But first, Smith had to understand the heart before the market, the moral before the mechanical. At Oxford, his curiosity met the walls of tradition. He found the university dull, stagnant, still ruled by dogma. He once wrote that the professors taught by rote what they had long forgotten to understand. Disillusioned but not broken, Smith turned inward. He read voraciously. Newton, Locke, Hume, seeking patterns beneath the apparent chaos of life. If Newton had uncovered the laws that governed the heavens, could there also be laws that governed human society? The thought haunted him. He saw how gravity drew planets into balance, not through coercion, but through natural motion. What if human cooperation worked the same way? What if moral sympathy, the capacity to feel another's pain, was the social gravity of mankind? That question would become the seed of the theory of moral sentiments, his first masterpiece. But before it was a book, it was a confession, a moral revelation, written by a man who believed that the universe's greatest order came not from control, but from understanding. In later years, Smith would recall his youth as a time when philosophy and life still shared a heartbeat. He remembered his mother's gentle wisdom, that no system of thought could justify cruelty, and no pursuit of gain could excuse indifference. Her moral compass would shape every argument he ever made. He would teach that even the most rational market is built upon the emotional architecture of trust. Without empathy, commerce collapses. Without virtue, freedom corrodes into selfishness. As he matured, Smith grew aware of his own contradictions. He loved solitude, but lectured passionately. He was skeptical of power, but advised governments. He despised vanity, yet became one of Europe's most sought-after thinkers. And in those paradoxes, he glimpsed the human condition itself, a balance between desire and restraint, self and society. Returning to Scotland, he began to lecture on logic, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. But his classroom was more than an academic space, it was a forge of ideas. Students described him as absent-minded, yet magnetic, speaking as if from the border between philosophy and poetry. He urged them to look beyond appearances, to see in every transaction, every exchange of labor or word, a reflection of moral choice. Smith once told a student, "Man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely." In that phrase lies the foundation of his worldview. The human soul seeks recognition, but also deserves to deserve it. Morality, therefore, is not imposed from above, it is born from the longing to be worthy in the eyes of others. In that sense, markets, like friendships, are moral theatres, where we reveal who we are by how we treat one another. Spells by the time he met David Hume, Smith's intellectual compass had found its north. Hume, the skeptic, Smith, the moralist. Together they would form one of history's quietest revolutions, a friendship that bridged reason and sentiment, irony and faith in mankind. They disagreed often, but both saw what few dared to: that freedom without morality becomes greed, and morality without freedom becomes tyranny. There was Hume who told him, "Society is the greatest of all mirrors. In it we see ourselves reflected." Smith would spend the rest of his life polishing that mirror, trying to show that beneath the apparent chaos of trade and ambition there was an invisible harmony, if only we had the eyes to see it. And thus, before the world knew him as the father of economics, Adam Smith was already something rarer: a moral cartographer. He had begun mapping the unseen geography of the human heart. The moral laws of sympathy and virtue would soon collide with the material forces of commerce and empire, and from that collision a new idea of freedom would emerge. By the mid-18th century, Europe was awakening to a new faith, not in gods but in reason. Empires traded silk for gunpowder, kings taxed the seas, and philosophers began to ask whether morality could survive without heaven watching. Amid this noise, Adam Smith wrote something profoundly quiet. Not a treatise on gold or commerce, but on the heart. It was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, a book that dared to say that civilization begins not with power, but with sympathy. He began from a single observation: we are creatures of feeling before we are creatures of calculation. When we see another person suffer, we instinctively flinch, not out of duty, but out of shared humanity. That movement of the heart, that spontaneous compassion, was to Smith what gravity was to Newton, an invisible force binding mankind together. He called it sympathy, but he meant something deeper than pity. It was imaginative identification, the moral imagination that allows us to inhabit another's pain or joy. Through sympathy, the ego learns to coexist. Through empathy, the marketplace of emotions becomes the foundation of every other exchange, including those of labor, wealth, and trust. Smith argued that we live constantly before an impartial spectator, a moral mirror we carry within. It is not the eye of God, nor the gaze of the state. It is conscience itself. The internal observer that asks, "Would I approve of myself if I were someone else?" This inner witness, Smith believed, was what made moral order possible without coercion. No law could compel virtue if the heart did not already desire to be virtuous. This was the quiet revolution of the theory of moral sentiments. At a time when Europe's thinkers divided reason from feeling, Smith united them. He showed that morality is not an obstacle to self-interest. It is its natural boundary. We seek approval, but not any approval. We wish to be deserving of admiration. Virtue, then, is not imposed from above. It grows from the longing to be lovely, to live a life worthy of love. In Smith's lectures in Edinburgh, students heard philosophy as something alive. He spoke without notes, his voice calm but trembling with conviction. He told them, "The chief part of human happiness arises from the consciousness of being beloved." Those words captured a truth the modern world would soon forget. that beneath all systems and prices lies a deeper market, the trade of recognition. In Smith's universe, the invisible hand was not yet a law of economics. It was a moral metaphor, the unseen balance between self-love and social harmony. He saw society as a vast orchestra of intentions, where each instrument played for itself, yet somehow produced music together. Harmony was not designed, it emerged. That was the miracle, that moral order could arise spontaneously from individual freedom. But this idea came with a warning. Sympathy could decay. When admiration turns toward the rich merely for being rich, virtue erodes into vanity. Smith feared that in every society, admiration would migrate from the good to the glittering. When wealth replaces virtue as the measure of worth, nations begin to rot from within. Quietly, elegantly, fatally. He wrote, "The great mob of mankind are the admirers and worshippers of wealth and greatness." That sentence still echoes through centuries, not as cynicism, but as prophecy. Smith saw that inequality, left unchecked, distorts not only economics but morality itself. When admiration flows toward power instead of goodness, even sympathy becomes corrupted. We begin to feel more for the successful than for the suffering. Yet Smith did not despair. He believed human nature contained its own antidote, the impartial spectator within us, the inner conscience that could recall us to virtue. He trusted that education, conversation, and commerce itself, when honest, could refine the moral sentiments of a people. Because every act of fair trade, every promise kept, was also an act of respect. Commerce, when rooted in virtue, became moral education by practice. That is what made Smith a moral optimist. He did not see humanity as fallen, nor as perfectible, but as capable of balance. He wrote of the man of system, the reformer who imagines society like a chessboard, moving human beings as if they were pieces. Against this arrogance, Smith offered humility. Each piece has a principle of motion of its own. To forget that is to destroy freedom itself. This insight would later define his economic vision, that prosperity cannot be engineered. It must emerge. Just as moral order arises from sympathy, economic order arises from voluntary exchange. The invisible hand of the market, before it was economic, was ethical. It was the principle that human beings, left free but bound by conscience, could create harmony without command. He once confessed in a letter that his book was a history of the moral sentiments of mankind. But it was more than history, it was a philosophy of trust. He saw that civilization depends not on laws or armies, but on the invisible glue of shared feeling. We obey laws because we agree to, not because we are forced to. We keep promises because we wish to remain worthy of love. And that, not profit, is what makes nations truly rich. Edinburgh, candlelight on Smith's desk, papers scattered with notes. When Smith looked back on the manuscript that had consumed a decade of his life, he must have sensed that he had only written half the story. He had mapped the moral foundations of society, but not yet its material engines. He had described why we ought to live together, but not how we manage to. The second half of his life would answer that question, and in doing so, he would create a book that would transform the world. A book that would both reveal and mislead, enlighten and be misunderstood. It would make his name immortal and his meaning fragile. Before long, he would leave Scotland for France, where he would dine with Voltaire, Turgot, and Quesnay, the architects of the physiocratic dream who believed that wealth sprang from the soil and the natural order of production. Smith would listen, politely, but he sensed that something greater was stirring. That wealth was not just in land, but in labor, in human ingenuity itself. In Paris, amid salons and revolutions of thought, Smith's philosophy of sympathy began to collide with the machinery of commerce. He saw that emotion alone could not sustain society. It needed structure. Markets, laws, prices. The moral and the mechanical had to be reconciled. He began to write again, quietly, methodically, as if sketching a second map. This time, not of hearts, but of nations. Distant strings, slow rhythm of travel. Paris, 1764, Adam Smith walks through the salons of the Enlightenment, rooms filled with candles, smoke and debate. Turgot speaks of agriculture. Quesnay preaches the natural order of production. Voltaire laughs, sharp and untouchable. Smith listens more than he speaks, taking notes in silence. He sees brilliance, but also blindness. The French thinkers worship the land, but Smith senses that the real revolution is not in the soil, but in the mind of the worker. In those glittering salons, he glimpses the dawn of a new age, one driven not by divine decree, but by human labor, specialization, and exchange. If the theory of moral sentiments had revealed the invisible order of the heart, now he sought the invisible order of productivity, the mechanism by which freedom could sustain itself materially. He returns to Scotland changed. For nearly a decade, he withdraws from public life, writing in silence. Friends worry he has vanished, but he is building something vast, a system that will describe how nations grow rich, not through conquest, but through cooperation, through the honest rhythm of work and trade. The year of revolutions. Across the Atlantic, America declares its independence. In Britain, the Industrial Revolution is about to roar to life. And in Edinburgh, Smith releases a book that will become one of the most misunderstood masterpieces in human history, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. It begins, not with kings or empires, but with a pin factory, a small, ordinary place. Yet from it, Smith extracts a revelation. 10 workers, each performing a single task, can together produce thousands of pins a day, more than any one of them could make alone. This, he writes, is the power of the division of labor, the quiet miracle by which specialization multiplies human potential. But Smith's insight is not mechanical, it is moral. He sees in labor a form of dignity, a structure of cooperation where each person, pursuing their own interest, unwittingly contributes to the common good. Here again, the invisible hand appears, not as an idol of greed, but as a principle of unintended harmony. When people are free to act, bound by justice and guided by conscience, their pursuits intersect into balance. Smith argued that wealth was not gold locked in a king's vault, but the total of what a nation could produce. The strength of a country lay in its people, in their labor, their creativity, their trust in one another. Every time two individuals exchanged goods voluntarily, both became richer, not only in possessions, but in possibility. Freedom, he realized, was not merely a moral condition, it was an economic engine. Yet this idea, as luminous as it was, carried shadows. Smith saw that the same forces that liberated mankind could also enslave him in new ways. Factories could create abundance, but also alienation. Markets could connect strangers across oceans, but also distance neighbors across streets. He never romanticized commerce, he sought to humanize it. He warned that when profit becomes the end rather than the means, the invisible hand turns cold. To Smith, markets were not sacred. They were fragile social systems, dependent on virtue and justice. He wrote, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable." He saw poverty not as failure, but as a signal, a moral imbalance, an indicator that the market's moral foundation was weakening. He believed government had a role, limited but real, to protect justice, defend the nation, and provide public works that private interest would never build. Roads, bridges, schools. He was not the prophet of laissez-faire that later ideologues made of him. He was rather the philosopher of proportion, of freedom disciplined by empathy, of ambition constrained by fairness. In the rhythm of trade, Smith saw the rhythm of human nature. Each transaction was a form of dialogue. Give me what I want, and you shall have what you want. Through this reciprocity, strangers learned to trust. In this trust, civilization found stability. The invisible hand, then, was not magic, it was morality made practical. But Smith was no idealist. He saw the dangers ahead. He warned that monopolies would seek to corrupt markets, that businessmen, left unchecked, would conspire against the public. The interest of the dealers, he wrote, is always different from that of the public. He knew that freedom without vigilance decays into privilege, and privilege into power. As the wealth of nations spread across Europe, Smith became a reluctant celebrity. Politicians quoted him, merchants adored him, radicals misread him. To some, he was the champion of self-interest, to others, a heretic who dethroned kings and priests. But to Smith himself, he was merely a witness, a moral philosopher describing how the machinery of human cooperation could serve both prosperity and virtue. He wrote, "Man is an animal that makes bargains." But what he meant was deeper, that the capacity to bargain, to see another person as a partner rather than prey, is what makes us human. Commerce was civilization's proof of empathy in action. In his later years, Smith returned to his mother's home in Kirkcaldy, where his journey had begun. He walked again by the sea, older now, surrounded by the world his ideas had helped to shape. A world of industry, invention, and inequality. He watched ships depart, just as he had as a boy, carrying the goods of nations and the dreams of men. Perhaps he wondered whether the wealth he had described would indeed make the world more humane or simply more efficient. For Smith, the question remained moral. The market, he believed, could organize production, but could it cultivate virtue? Freedom could create wealth, but could it sustain wisdom? He never wrote the third book that would have reconciled these tensions. He left us with a pair of mirrors, one reflecting the heart, the theory of moral sentiments, the other reflecting the hand, the wealth of nations. Between them lies the enduring question of his philosophy. Can freedom survive the desire to control it? As he grew ill, Smith burned many of his manuscripts, not out of vanity but humility. He feared posterity might mistake drafts for doctrine. He wished to be remembered not as an economist, but as a moral philosopher who had tried to describe, with honesty, the fragile beauty of a free society. Friends who visited him near the end said he remained serene, reflective, almost detached from fame. He spoke little of economics, knowing more of virtue, friendship, and the mystery of human cooperation. The invisible hand, he seemed to realize, was not an external force, but the gentle coordination of countless moral choices. A human symphony, always imperfect, always in motion. Tone, Edinburgh, 1790. The air is still. The Enlightenment's fires are dimming. Adam Smith lies in his study, surrounded by notes, letters, and the quiet hum of a world he helped define. Outside, the world is already moving faster than he imagined. Factories rising, engines burning, wealth multiplying beyond measure. His mind, once devoted to understanding the invisible harmony of mankind, now contemplates its dissonance. He has seen his ideas travel farther than any ship that ever left Kirkcaldy. But he has also seen how easily ideas, once freed, can be twisted by those who seek power in their name. The moral philosopher who spoke of sympathy and justice has become, in public imagination, the prophet of profit. He had warned of it, the corruption of admiration, the temptation to mistake wealth for virtue, success for wisdom. And yet the age that followed him did exactly that. In the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, the wealth of nations became scripture for a new kind of faith, the belief that the market alone could redeem mankind. Factories multiplied, steam replaced muscle, and labor, the dignity he had once praised, became a number on a ledger. Smith's invisible hand, once a poetic metaphor for moral balance, was recast as a mechanism of inevitability, a justification for greed disguised as natural law. What he had written as a harmony between freedom and conscience became, in the hands of others, a chorus of self-interest. And yet, beneath the smoke and iron, traces of his true vision remained. He never believed that self-interest was enough. He believed it must be balanced by virtue, that markets, like hearts, collapse when trust evaporates. He saw that wealth unrestrained by morality would devour itself, leaving abundance without purpose. In his lectures, he had spoken of commutative justice, the fairness of exchange, and distributive justice, the duty to maintain the bonds of society. He understood that civilization requires both liberty and restraint, that freedom without sympathy is savagery, and sympathy without freedom is slavery. After his death, the world entered a new century intoxicated with progress. The steam engine, the telegraph, the rail, all seemed to prove his vision right. Productivity rising, nations prospering, trade knitting continents together. But the human cost, the children in factories, the sweat, the exhaustion, revealed that progress could be as cruel as it was creative. Smith's moral foundation was fading beneath the weight of industry. Then came the economists who claimed his legacy: Ricardo, Mill, Marx. Each reinterpreted him, each in their own mirror. To Ricardo, he was the father of labor and exchange. To Marx, the tragic precursor of alienation. To liberals, the saint of free markets. But none fully saw the man who had written the theory of moral sentiments, the philosopher who believed that markets were not machines, but moral organisms. It is one of history's ironies that Adam Smith, who spent his life warning against idolatry, became an idol himself, a name invoked to justify policies he would have condemned, a face carved into marble by those who never read his heart. Yet perhaps this was inevitable, for every great idea, once unleashed, must wrestle with the imperfect hands of history. Smith's ghost would haunt the 19th century. The industrial barons invoked him. The reformers rediscovered him. His words appeared in parliaments and protests alike. For some, he was a weapon against tyranny. For others, a shield against compassion. But through every interpretation, one truth endured: that human freedom, once awakened, could not easily be chained again. The 20th century would rediscover him in fragments. To Hayek, he became the prophet of spontaneous order. To Keynes, the silent partner in a larger moral dialogue about intervention and stability. To Friedman, a patron saint of liberty. But Smith himself might have smiled at the irony that economists built empires of theory while forgetting the tenderness of his first insight, that the true wealth of nations lies in their people's capacity for empathy. He had seen markets as living systems, extensions of the same sympathy that binds families and friends. When those systems lose their moral core, they become monstrous, efficient, yet empty. He believed the invisible hand could only guide where invisible hearts still cared. His philosophy, at its deepest, was not about commerce, but about conscience. He never asked how to make men richer. He asked how they could remain good while becoming rich. That is why his moral and economic works were never meant to be read apart. They were the two lungs of the same philosophy, breathing together. Meditative later, his dilemma remains ours. We have mastered the mechanics of prosperity, yet we still struggle with the meaning of value. We have learned to measure growth but not contentment, productivity but not purpose. Smith foresaw this imbalance, that the modern world would mistake wealth for worth, efficiency for virtue, and liberty for license. But he also believed in renewal. He believed that societies could educate the heart as well as the hand, that through conversation, compassion, and honest trade, the moral sentiments could be revived, that progress need not erase empathy, but expand it. Freedom to him was not an end but a responsibility, the duty to use one's independence in service of the greater good. In that sense, Adam Smith was not the architect of capitalism, but its conscience. He gave the modern world its grammar of exchange, yet warned that the story would collapse if it forgot its ethics. His invisible hand was never a command to worship markets, but an invitation to trust in humanity's capacity for order, honesty, and compassion. He once wrote, "Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition." But perhaps he meant something deeper. That understanding, of ourselves, of each other, is the only true wealth we ever possess. As the light fades from his study, Smith's last thoughts, we imagine, might have been of his mother, the woman who first taught him that love, not logic, is the origin of virtue. She never read his books, but she lived his philosophy. From her, he learned that sympathy is not weakness, but strength, the invisible thread that makes freedom possible. Outside, the world he shaped moves on, restless, inventive, conflicted. The engines of commerce still hum. The markets still pulse with ambition, But behind every transaction, behind every algorithm and price, his question still whispers. Can a system built on self-interest sustain a species built for empathy?